Hey everybody, it's time for my first lecture on Virgil's Aeneid. There's quite a bit of background information and auxiliary sort of information that I want to give you today that will be helpful as we spend several classes reading and discussing the Aeneid. I'll obviously be doing some more lectures on the Aeneid. But I wanted to give you some of that initial information and then just talk a little bit about the first two books, or we can think of them as the first two chapters of Virgil's Aeneid, and just so that you can feel like you're sort of up to speed and able to follow what's going on. It's a really complex text. It's really fascinating because it does have so many layers to it, historical layers and layers, again, related to mythology and related to historical events that were actually occurring before and around the time this was written. So I want to just make sure that that I get you up to speed on those things. So first, a little bit about Virgil. He was born in 70 BC in the Andes in Italy and died in 19 BC in Brundisium, also in Italy. So he lived just about 50 years. And you can see that he's just about to, we're about to move into the period of the birth of the historical Jesus. Obviously not too long after Virgil's death. So the Aeneid is basically considered to be the national epic of the people of Italy. That obviously centers on Rome and the founding of Rome. And that's really, I think, significant. It was a major chore that Virgil took on in trying to write this epic. It actually is a very long poem. What we're reading is obviously a translation that is put in more of a narrative form. So it reads more like a novel than a poem, but it actually was written as a very long poem around the hero of the founding of Rome named Aeneas. So just a little bit about Virgil. He was born of very humble parents. His father, it seems, was a laborer, but he did work for somebody named Magius, who was very wealthy and really liked Virgil a lot. So he allowed Virgil to marry his daughter. So Virgil's father actually married into wealth. That meant that Virgil was provided with a really good education, the kind of education that people of the wealthy would have received at the time. He studied in Milan, Cremona, and then went on to study rhetoric in Rome. In this case, rhetoric as the study of writing. Also studied medicine, mathematics, etc., and philosophy. So really well educated. And obviously, he pulled from all those sources in writing the Aeneid. Essentially, it was the kind of preparation that you would have typically have had for law, to be a lawyer of some kind or be involved in the law profession. But Virgil was sort of an introvert, shy, kind of halting of speech, and wouldn't have been very effective in the law courts in Rome, where you needed to be really aggressive and well-spoken, etc. So that's perhaps one reason he ultimately didn't go in that direction. He wrote 3 important sets of poems that are well known today, along with the Aeneid as maybe the things that he's sort of most famous for, called the Eclogues, the Georgics, and the Bucolics. And they were different, they had different themes to them, so you can kind of tell by the names. And they basically looked at different aspects of life in Italy for people sort of at the time. The eclogues are basically, are also known as the bucolics or pastorals. and really are about shepherds and the life of shepherds, what it is to be a shepherd, etc. Um, Eclogue number 4 is known as the Messianic Eclogue, Messianic. Messianic means related to the Messiah, related to Christ. It's given that term because in this poem, um, it kind of people think it foreshadowed the birth of Christ. And remember, he just died 19 years before the birth of the historical Jesus, um, and was supposed to usher in a golden age and a new era for the people. Um, and other people sort of thought that perhaps it was referring to Emperor Augustus and his child. However, that turned out to be a girl. But nonetheless, there seemed to be something prophetic in Virgil's writing of Augustus, of um, this infant of Augustus, of the coming of Christ, etc. That is also really important here. The Georgics are really about farming, and they're very didactic. Didactic means intended to instruct. Um, and that was a poem written in 4 different books, um, and different aspects of farming and growing trees. The vine, obviously grapes, grape harvest is important. Olives, we know how important those are in this sort of area of the world. Um, and then I think usually people consider the third element here. If we've got the eclogues and the bucolics is the first, the Georgics is the Aeneid itself, um, which we'll be obviously talking about today. And essentially, it details, as you could tell from the first couple of books that we read, um, the fall of Troy, and then the travels of Aeneas with the folks that survived the fall of Troy, and their long travels to eventually found a place in Italy known as Lavinium, which is the parent town of what would eventually be Rome. And the way it really came about in terms of his writing this, after Actium, you may have heard of that very famous battle of the Roman Civil War from 31 BC. Emperor Augustus wanted somebody to kind of write about the history of Rome, um, how it achieved the status that it had acquired at that point. Obviously, he wanted to be included in it himself, as having had an important place in that. So, sort of a kind of literary enhancement in the form of some kind of epic poem or some kind of history. Um, he offered it to Propertius and to Horace. They both declined. I think being concerned perhaps that if Augustus wasn't happy with what they wrote, that they might be in trouble. They didn't want to fall in disfavor with Augustus. Virgil kind of came up with a solution, and his solution was to write this sort of epic poem, this literary enhancement of what Rome had achieved, and Augustus is part of that, by incorporating mythology and writing it in the form of mythology as a kind of, again, a kind of retelling of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So it's a kind of Roman retelling with Roman gods of the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer, which were obviously incorporated the Greek gods. You will see some of the same mythological creatures show up, and we'll talk about those. We'll start running into those in large numbers, and as we get into book 3, which really is when Aeneas starts talking about where they went to directly after leaving Troy, after the fall of Troy, and how they ended up going from Troy to Carthage, where the area is from book 2. Um, and I'll show you a map of that. Your edition of the book probably has a map that you can kind of see kind of where we are in this part of the world and where those travels are. But I have a map I'll put up on the screen as well. So by doing it in the form of mythology, again, he could use certain kinds of enhancements, incorporating mythology, um, and even linking Augustus in with this mythology. which was again was still important to the people at this point. And myth, as we know, also has an element of fiction in it as well that that Virgil could incorporate and use those kind of the enhancements, literary enhancements he would use was something with mythology in ways that you could say things that wouldn't necessarily reflect negatively on Rome or negatively on Augustus, and so that was his approach to doing this. Um, he worked on it for the last 11 years of his life, um, and composing it first in kind of a prose form and then putting it in poetic form. Um, he had said at one point, I have undertaken a task so difficult that I think I must have been mentally ill to have begun it because of how challenging, this was, what a huge task it was. And you can tell in reading it, all the detail, the kind of sources that Virgil was pulling from to write it, that indeed you can imagine it taking very long time to write. And he actually died before completing it. Um, and he left instructions that it should be burned, what it was thus far at that point. And Augustus actually refused and ordered Varius and Tuca, two friends of the poet, to actually edit it for publication. And it actually appeared in 17 BC. So Virgil dies in 19 BC. 2 years later, the Aeneid is published. And I'll show you a quick picture here of Virgil. As you can imagine, he has been rendered in various kinds of form, um, paintings, sculpture, etc. So here's one of the more famous paintings of Virgil, obviously holding a book that perhaps is um, supposed to represent the Aeneid, but there you can see a picture of Virgil. So that's the kind of the first background information I wanted to share with you. I also wanted to share with you, as we get into talking about Troy and the fall of Troy, just a kind of picture of Troy itself as a city. And again, these were walled cities at the time. It was a pretty large city. We know that this was the city that where the Trojan people dragged this gift, parent gift from the Greeks, this huge wooden horse into the city, and sort of what happened after they did that, took that unwise step. And you can actually see the gates of the city there on the left-hand side of the picture, and how careful they were to construct the gates to make it very difficult for somebody to kind of break in through the gates and be able to survive that. Right, there's these really long walls leading into the gate. Is probably several. My guess is there may have been several gates here in succession. You can see it kind of narrows as you come to the actually into the city itself. Plenty of walls that you could fire down on people who were trying to come in through the gates. So they're extremely careful to construct these gates in a way that made it very difficult. It's not impossible for somebody to break through the gates. But nonetheless, they decided to allow this Trojan horse, as it's called now, into the city. And that was a kind of a major step in their demise, as we will talk about. So I wanted to go over now some of the characters in the story. They're obviously really important. And it's important to do your best to keep those straight, and because it does get a little confusing at points. So I'm going to first share with you a list of the human characters to go over briefly, and then we can go over the gods. And so, see if I get the right one here. These are hard to see. The icons are very small. So here are the essentially the human characters. So first, obviously, we have Aeneas, right? And Aeneas, however, as you discovered in your first section of reading, is actually part um, human, part God. His father was human, and you can see his father here. His name is Anchises. We'll find out that Anchises didn't survive very long into the story. He actually ended up passing away in Sicily and was buried there. Um, Dido is the queen of Carthage. Carthage is in the area also known as Libya in northern North Africa. And the area of North Africa where it's really closest to Sicily and Italy. And again, you'll be able to see that here shortly on a map that I'll show you of the travels of Aeneas and his people. Ascades was a friend and companion of Aeneas. There'll be lots of references to other kind of heroes of the Trojan people, the great warriors who were friends with Aeneas, and how important they are here and the kind of mostly secondary roles they play, but nonetheless really important as companions of Aeneas. Creusa is Aeneas' wife, his first wife. He does remarry again much later in the story. And Creusa, as we know, does not survive the fall of Troy. When Aeneas had to flee from Troy, he made sure to take Ascanius, who was his son, or Iulus is the other name for Ascanius, and so you'll see both of those in the text. So make sure that that's clear, sort of in your mind as you're reading, that both of these names are referring to the same person, Aeneas' son. Aeneas' son is maybe the most important person here in a certain sense, because he is actually the one who will found this city that will be the precursor to Rome. So it's really important that he survive, that he be taken care of, that he be well educated as much as possible, and again looked after and kept safe, etc. So it was important, obviously, when Aeneas was fleeing from Troy to take Ascanius with him, along with his father, who he throws up over his shoulder. Creusa is supposedly following along behind. We find out that she doesn't make it all the way. At some point, she's left behind and ultimately killed. And again, that is something that's also been documented in paintings, and I'll show you one later that's kind of a picture of that. But it's a great scene, seeing and it's the scene and the painting is really portrayed exactly like it's described in the book, with Aeneas looking very heroic, even though he's fleeing the scene here. And we'll talk about that too. That's really important. His father up over his shoulder. His father looks very old, you can tell. Ascanius by his side, Creusa following along behind, and as I said, not actually making it out of Troy. So those are the main human characters here. I should also mention, because he's discussed, though really briefly, we see Priam, who's the king of Troy, who was killed defending his city during the attack after the Greeks have made their way into the city. And Hector is also mentioned as another one of the heroes of Troy. So there were a couple other people that were mentioned here early on in the story, and you get a sense from who they are as Aeneas retells the events of the fall of Troy. So let me then share with you now the important gods that are portrayed in the story here. So the first two I'm going to point out here are Juno and Jupiter, who are husband and wife. Jupiter is the father of the gods, the most powerful of the gods, also known as Zeus in Greek mythology, right? Then we have Juno, also known as Hera in Greek mythology. and she's an enemy of Aeneas and his companions. And you can tell that early on the story, because at the very first scene, she's trying to destroy as much as she can Aeneas and his ships by creating this huge storm on the water, where they eventually end up at Carthage in that first book of the story. Juno's daughter is Venus, also known as Aphrodite in Greek mythology. She is the daughter of Juno and the mother of Aeneas. So Anchises is Aeneas' human father. Venus is Aeneas' mother, who is one of the gods. There's a lot of tension, dislike even between Juno and Venus. Juno is very jealous of Venus because it's been said that Venus is more beautiful than Juno. It's been said that Aeneas and his family, his son, will found this great Roman city. She's not really happy about that. Again, there's more detail that I'll get into here shortly. Neptune, the god of the sea. Remember that Neptune is the person that Juno goes to create this huge storm on the water to try and destroy Aeneas' ships. And then we actually have fate, or the fates as they're called, the moirae is the Greek term. Supernatural forces more powerful than the gods that cause events. There's a document in Canvas that talks a little bit about the fates, and I'll pop it up on the screen here a little later and talk about the fates. But just for now, remember that they're actually more powerful than the gods. Even though the gods can manipulate events and try to throughout the story, ultimately the fates are more powerful. And you can see that word fate there, right? They determine how long your life is and the basic story of your life. And that cannot be changed. That is essentially sort of carved in stone. So the fates are really important there. So those are the main gods that we'll run across. There's some other ones here and there. Mercury, the messenger, and here I'll show you the Greek and Roman counterparts of these gods to try to help you keep them straight. And again, this document is one that you can find in Canvas as well, that will show you kind of compare and contrast them. So we have the goddess of love here, Venus, who again is Aeneas' mother, otherwise known as Aphrodite. The god of war, Mars. We have Ares as the Greek counterpart, probably familiar with. Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. And then we have Athena, who is the Greek god, who was the kind of patron god, goddess, I should say, of the people of Athens. Bacchus, the god of wine. You may have heard that term Bacchus before, or Dionysus, kind of representing the grape harvest and the kind of behavior we associate with inebriation. We have the god of love, Cupid. Cupid plays a role here in helping Aeneas and Dido to fall in love. And we know the Greek counterpart, Eros, god of the underworld, Pluto. Aeneas will take a journey through the underworld, and Hades being the Greek counterpart. Vulcan, we will hear more from Vulcan, the god of fire in the forge. Vulcan is actually Venus's husband among the gods. So Venus apparently has a husband, a mortal husband, Anchises, who is the father of Aeneas. And Venus also has a husband apparently among the gods, who is Vulcan, who makes a very famous shield to help Aeneas in some of the battles he's going to have to fight. And that shield, as we read about it, is very heroic. It portrays all these kind of great events of the people of Troy and etc. Again, Juno, queen of the gods, Hera, again the Greek counterpart, Mercury, the messenger of the gods, otherwise known as Hermes. You see pictures of Mercury. I think the FTD flower people use Mercury in their sort of iconography, often portrayed having wings on his feet. We have the god of the sea, right? Neptune, the Roman version, Poseidon, the Greek version, and then we have the king of the gods, Jupiter, on the Roman side, Zeus on the Greek side. So again, you can find this document just to help you keep them straight in the in Canvas under files under the folder for the Aeneid. You will run across those Roman gods because probably almost half of them here will be involved in some way or another in the story at various points. And you might already know of them, but you might only know of them through their Greek name, or you might only know the Roman name. I just wanted to make sure you had both here to kind of work from. And then before we get into book one, lastly, let me show you here this document about the fates that is really important. Because a lot of people don't realize that the fates are actually more powerful than the gods. And the fact that they're more powerful, what that means is really important for the story here. So as it says in Roman mythology, the fates or the parquet or the personifications of destiny, right? They determine your ultimate destiny. The Greek equivalent there, the moirae, as I already mentioned, they control the metaphorical thread of life of every mortal and immortal from birth to death, right? So again, all powerful here. Even the gods feel the parquet. Jupiter, right, who was the king of the gods in Roman mythology, was even subject to their power. There are three of them. Nona, who spun the thread of life from her distaff onto the spindle. Decima, who measured the thread of life with her rod. And Morta, who cut the thread of life and chose the manner of a person's death. And you can see that in the name Morta. So they would basically determine when your life started, how long your life of, when your life ended, and kind of the basic direction that your life would go in. It was the fates who had determined, as kind of a prophecy, that Jupiter was aware of, and that also Juno and Venus were aware of, and that Aeneas becomes aware of. That Aeneas, his son, Iulus, would found this city that would be the precursor to Rome. That was going to happen, regardless of how anybody interferes in events. That's really important to kind of remember. The earliest extant document of these deities are three small stelae. Those are large wooden stones that have some kind of writing on them, found near the location of ancient Lavinium. This is the city that Iulus is going to found. They were found shortly after the end of World War II. There's an inscription about who they are, what they do, etc. So remember the parquet here, or the fates. Remember that they're more powerful than the gods, and that they're ultimately going to be determining what's going to happen to Aeneas, and therefore what's going to happen to his people. And that ultimately can't be changed, as much as Juno, as we see, is going to try and interfere with it. So in book one, we start out with Aeneas and his people. They've been traveling a long time. They're already a long way through their journey. And this storm comes up off the coast of Sicily, so kind of in between North Africa and Sicily. And the ships are just in really bad shape. They're falling apart. The masts are crashing down. And Aeneas is watching this from his ship. The ship, they're being destroyed. They're being dashed along the rocks along the coast. Things are just really terrible. But they do make it to Carthage. They don't know where they are at that point. They're not aware of what Carthage is necessarily, or who Dido is. but that is sort of where they end up. Those of them that are left. He doesn't know where some of his ships are, some of his sailors. They seem to be gone. They seem to have disappeared. Um, and so you'll see here, essentially, where they are so far in this journey. And again, your edition of the story should have a map in it that will show this path. It's a little hard to follow in the math and the map, excuse me, and I think it's the Penguin version that that I ordered for the class. This might be actually a little easier to follow. So they're starting out here in Troy, right, which is over here. And this is where the city was under siege for a long time under the Greeks. And we have the story of Achilles, and all of that, those famous events that we know of from Homer's Iliad occurring here. When they leave Troy, Aeneas and the people that he's able to escape with, they go south first, and they land here. They try to settle there, and they're basically told, and often it's the gods that are telling them this. Some of these mythological creatures will give them advice and tell them, no, this is not where you're supposed to end up. You need to keep traveling. And this is where Aeneas, really knows what his fate is, that he's supposed to found this city with his through his son. And gradually he learns more along the trip about where ultimately they're supposed to end up. And that's all the way over here. They end up traveling north for a time, and land here. That's not where they're supposed to end up. So back down south, Delos that we heard about in some of the things that we've already read, some of the Greek writings we've already read. We have Crete down here. And Ithaca, they end up spending a time here in Ithaca, up in this area. And we know we have Athens over here, and we have Sparta, though they're not on the map. You cross over here to Ithaca. To Italy, across from Ithaca over to Italy. Italy's shaped like this big boot, the heel of the boot, the toe of the boot, etc. They sail down along the coast. There's a place here called the Strait of Messina. You actually can get a ship through here. Aeneas is warned not to try it because of Scylla and Charybdis, who we'll read about. And they were a part of the mythology. And they would essentially dash your ship on the rocks, or there were also whirlpools there that would suck you down into them if you tried to get through there. So they have to take the long way around Sicily. Remember, Sicily is where the Athens undertook their last big major expedition from the war with Sparta. So again, you can see how far this was away from Athens when they tried this landing on Sicily in the city of Syracuse. So the Aeneas and his people land here. They're going around Syracuse, around Sicily. They land here. We'll find that Aeneas' father dies here, and they try to leave, and the wind is blowing them in a way that's making it very difficult for them to continue up north here. So they end up kind of being caught in here between North Africa, and again, Carthage here, or Libya, and Sicily. And the storm comes up because Juno is making Neptune cause this huge storm. The ships are in bad shape, so they end up having to run aground here and come and have to have some kind of temporary safety, at least in Carthage. But they don't necessarily know where they are. They don't know what's going to happen there. The first two books of the story are essentially the storm. Right when the storm starts, they end up here at Carthage. We meet Dido, who's the queen of Carthage, who has recently lost her husband, and she has vowed never to marry again. I believe Zacchaeus was the name of her husband. we find out that Aeneas will fall in love with Dido. There's that's a very famous part of the book, especially when Aeneas will eventually have to leave her. They fall in love, etc. So that's the first part of the book, and so essentially book one of the Aeneid. There's a major feast for the people of Troy. They find out that Dido and her people already have heard about the story, because they've been traveling a long time. They've heard about the story of the fall of Troy and how brave the Trojans were to try and defend their city, and their statuary that's actually already up in Carthage, even though they're still in the process of kind of building up the city. And so they accept them as friends. There's this big feast, and involves music and everything for Aeneas and all of his great hero warriors and sailors, etc. And she wants to know the story. What happened exactly? How did you end up here? So much of the beginning of the book is actually a retelling of what happened with the fall of Troy and Aeneas escaping with his people. That's book 2 in particular of the story. So that's what we've read thus far. What we're going to read next is what happened after they left Troy, all the way up through Anchises' death, and then trying to get up here, finally up into the area here that's eventually is going to be Lavinium or Rome. They have the cities listed here in black, regions in red, islands in purple here, the different capes that they had to sail around in brown. So you can basically see where they sailed here. So this is the complete journey of Aeneas and his people. So why is it that Juno created this storm, and used Neptune to create it, to do what she could to destroy Aeneas's fleet? Essentially, Juno was trying to interrupt Aeneas on his way to complete his journey that would end up in the founding of Rome. And I mentioned there was some jealousy on the part of Venus involved, her daughter Venus, who again was the father of Aeneas, and that sort of plays a role here. But the major part of this issue here is that, like the other gods, Juno had a patron sort of city. When she took human form, it's where she would spend her time. That happened to be Carthage, where she kept her armor and her shield and her sword and, those other kinds of things you would need when you took human form. Rome carried out a series of wars, or actually 3 of them, called Punic Wars, held between Rome and Carthage. Aeneas doesn't know about these because they hadn't occurred yet. Virgil obviously knows about them by the point that he's obviously writing this story. And during those wars, eventually, Rome will completely destroy Carthage. And they destroy it at a time where Carthage really is not in a position to really be a danger anymore to Rome. But they really destroy it anyway, just out of hatred, anger. It's kind of a sign of the fact that the Roman Empire at that point is kind of falling apart. They're not acting rationally anymore, etc. So there were these 3 Punic Wars. Again, Juno cannot keep these wars from happening, cannot keep Aeneas from founding Rome, but she can interrupt things. She can try and interfere with things as much as she can. Jupiter sees what's happening, stops the storm before Aeneas' ships are all completely destroyed. That would have involved a lot more effort to kind and save them. What Jupiter is also able to do is to kind of change the sequence of events so all the ships actually are not, destroyed. The ones that have been destroyed are saved and the sailors are saved for the most part. So that minimizing the damage of what happened. And Venus kind of plays a role here, telling Jupiter, look, you said that my son is supposed to have this great destiny, and Juno's trying to interfere with it. Why are you letting this happen? And this will happen several times in the story. Jupiter say, don't worry, it'll happen. I'll intervene in her interference and try and undo the damage that she does. The other thing that we know happens here after they land is that Venus appears in human form before Aeneas when he's out scouting the area. He's going to get food for his sailors and soldiers. And she comes to him in human form and basically tells him that, everything will be all right, etc. And it's kind of weird. He can kind of tell that she doesn't look like a mortal human being. At the very end, when they are parting, he can tell it's his mother, and he's kind of embarrassed, right? He kind of feels like a mama's boy a little bit, that she's had to come and telling me everything would be all right and patting me on the back and letting him know that she's overseeing him and helping him along. And he's a little embarrassed by this, ultimately. But nonetheless, she kind of this starts interfering a little bit, in part to try, along with Jupiter, to undo the damage that Juno has done. And we'll find out that the other thing that really happens here is, what's going to happen after Aeneas and his people are welcomed with open arms by the people of Carthage. And you can see that there's this relationship developing between Aeneas and Dido. How will Juno and Venus try and interfere? Right? Juno wanting to interfere to keep him there, because that will delay him from his journey. And Venus wanting to make sure he's safe there, but nonetheless wanting to make sure that he can carry out his destiny. And as we move through book 3, we'll hear more about that. Let me show you just briefly a map of these Punic Wars, so you can kind of see what occurred during those wars. Again, there were 3 major Punic Wars, and the first one involves the Romans, and they kind of carried a successful invasion of Carthaginian territory. They obviously, as you can tell probably from the map here, it says Carthaginian territory and Roman territory. They wanted to expand, right? They want control of Sicily, and the Carthaginians already have a lot of land here. So this is part of the conflict. And again, where they're eventually going to invade Carthage. So you see you can see a battle took place here. Another battle took place here. This is where we are in the story. We're right in the water here, and this is where we are in the story in Carthage during this festival where Aeneas recounts the events of what happened thus far. This second part of the campaign you're probably really familiar with here because it's very famous. It's when Hannibal takes his Carthaginian army up all the way up here, over the mount, through the mountains in the Pyrenees and the Alps, down through Italy to kind of attack Rome. Probably they never would have, the Roman people never would have imagined that Carthage could actually endanger them by coming down from the north here. And there are stories about, Hannibal using all these elephants to carry all of his soldiers and equipment of war, and having to drag them up through the mountains, and how long it took, and how obviously determined they were to do what they could to have some kind of revenge against Rome. So this is probably the most famous part of this series of wars. At the very end, Rome says, "Okay, enough already," and Carthage is in bad shape by this point, and they nonetheless destroy Carthage, and again, as I said, kind of plow it under. Um, and this is why Juno is really trying to interfere so much. She's trying to protect her beloved city of Carthage, essentially. So that's the cause for her interference. So let's talk a little bit about book one now, which is taking, in Troy, the fall of the city. How does that happen? How does Aeneas respond to that? I'll put up a picture of this famous painting that I already referenced briefly, that portrays Aeneas in very heroic fashion here. So you can see him, he's got his armor here. You can see that things are falling apart. You can see a fire here in the distance. This is his wife, Creusa, who doesn't make it out of the city. And here's his father, who does not make it. As we know, Anchises doesn't make it all the way through the story, but he does make it up through Sicily. So we'll see a little more from Anchises. He's important for the first part of the journey because he's older. He's heard stories before about prophecies and about what might have end up happening to the Trojan people. So it's important that he at least survived through part of the story. Creusa, we only see her at the very beginning here in recounting the fall of Troy. And this again is Aeneas' son, who's super important here. And remember that he has two names, Ascanus and Iulus. You'll see both of those terms here used for his son, but it's important that obviously he survive and be taken care of. So what happens with the fall of the city? So we know that the Greeks had Troy under siege for a long time. The Greeks were growing tired of the siege. It wasn't working out very well. You could see from the picture how well defended Troy was. So essentially, they're thinking of giving up. This sort of one last ditch effort. Let's try to trick them. Let's try and make it look like we're sailing away, and let's not really leave. They come up with this idea of creating this huge wooden horse. They're going to put some of their soldiers in the horse, try to get the Trojan people to bring the horse into the city. And when they do that, after they do that at night, the soldiers that are in the horse will get out of the horse, open the gates, and allow the rest of the Greek army in. And the Greek army will have been waiting essentially around the corner. So this is what they do. If they make it look like they sail away, but they don't go too far away, essentially they go around the corner with all their ships, make the Trojans think they're leaving. The Trojans come down to the camp, the Greek camp, and they see where Achilles' tent was and etc. They had been there a long time. There was lots of evidence, that they were there during this siege along the coast with their army. So they think that they're safe. And supposedly the Greeks tell them that, here's this horse. We have angered our gods. And, we failed in our siege and we want to appease the gods. So they told us to make this horse, as a gift. And then there's some other stories that get involved here in terms of they're actually bringing the horse into the city. They've already thought about the fact that there could be soldiers in the horse. They've already thought that could, that it could be a trick. They've already considered that. Aeneas supposedly was against them bringing this horse into the city. This is important because if Aeneas is going to be one of the progenitors of eventually of Emperor Augustus. He's not going to want his ancestor Aeneas look bad here. So this is a really important point for Virgil and how he tells the story. He does not want Aeneas look like he's responsible for the fall of Troy, or for the fact that, make it look like he just left the city and didn't try to defend it. He has to look heroic here. And you can kind of tell by the way this painting was made that the story details this part of the fall of Troy in a way that makes Aeneas look heroic, and he has to come across looking heroic here. So even though the Trojans know that that this whole thing could be a trick, they become really compelled to bring this horse into the city. And again, supposedly, the way the story is told, Virgil suggests you could actually hear the soldiers inside in their armor and shields and things clanking around as they're dragging it into the city. They do it nonetheless, and their trick is successful. So how does Aeneas come across here looking like a hero in the end? A couple different things happen. One is it's suggested that he was against them bringing the horse into the city to begin with. Number two, he essentially fought very hard to defend the city. And you can tell the way he's described here as doing his best to defend the city. And he even ends up seeing Priam, the king of Troy, and is going to help Priam, and sees Priam get killed. And he's like, what do I do here? Remember that his mother Venus comes to him and basically says it's all over. This is the end. Right. So he does get these kind of voices telling him that it's too late, that your destiny is elsewhere. You have to save yourself. You also have to save the gods of Troy from destruction and being taken. You don't want the Greeks to steal our gods and destroy our idols. That was something you definitely would not want to happen, because that would anger your gods and make things even worse for you. So he does everything he can to defend the city. He ultimately has to save the gods from the Greeks. He gets these voices telling him, your fate is elsewhere, you really need to leave. And it's all these things combined that Virgil uses to make Aeneas look like he's a heroic figure here. And again, we see how important that is, because Emperor Augustus, is going to be a part of his line of inheritance down the road here. And we move through Aeolus. We find out about, remember, Romulus and Remus and the whole Augustan family. That's often portrayed by a dolphin. You maybe have been aware of that scene, that in other iconography that'll be, I think that might be referenced in the story at some point as representing the Julian, family. So that that ultimately here we've got Jupiter and Juno as husband and wife. We have Juno down through Venus, Aeneas, Aeolus, etc., all the way to Augustus. So it actually makes Augustus look like he's a descendant of the gods, right? The notion of divine right of kings, as we know of it, sort of came along later in history as we move into the feudal era and the great monarchies, etc. But it's a similar kind of version of that, right? That the story makes it look like Augustus is in fact descended from the gods through Juno, Venus, Aeneas, Aeolus, etc. And so that's a part of the story here. So I think that's everything I wanted to tell you about for today for this first lecture. I'll do another lecture again soon. And I'll just point out some of the highlights of some of the places they stop and why they don't stay in those places. When Aeneas gets kind of messages that you need to move on, when he learns a little more about how long it's going to take to eventually land in Italy in the place they're supposed to stay, and that there are going to be lots of wars that take place. It's not going to be that they land in Italy and the people just say, okay, found your great city here, take over our peoples, our culture, replace us, whatever. There's going to be a lot of maneuvering Virgil's going to have to do in how he tells the story, because the people that are already there in Italy are many of the people that eventually would make up Italy as we know it, and the Roman people themselves, right? They are descendants of the people that are eventually um, um, become absorbed into the Trojan people and the remnants of the Trojan people from the city of Troy. So a lot of the story, again, left to tell. So I hope you found that helpful. Again, I'll be doing another lecture soon, and then we'll have some discussion questions we'll do. As always, I'll send you back the discussion questions with student responses and some of my additions to those. And again, hope you find those helpful. And again, I'll be posting this today on Saturday. Hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend.